Information Risk with David Loshin, powered by InsightJam.
Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and I am back with David Loshin for another episode of the Information Risk podcast. David, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you again after a couple of weeks. Got
right
some
on.
Stuff
well,
to talk about.
We have some more stuff to talk about. I think the information risk we're talking about today is compliance risk. Is that correct?
Well, it starts out with compliance risk, but it's actually shifts over pretty strongly into a risk area that we haven't really talked about because it's part of the way the business runs. But I think you're going to get the feel of it once we start talking.
Well, let's start talking. So we're talking about BCBS, compliance risk around banking. And obviously this has had a long and storied history going back, I think, to the 70s. And obviously there's been some rather significant inflection points along the way. And I think we're now up to what is referred to as Basel III, which is the third iteration of this international banking compliance standard. Why don't you outline a little bit of what the relevance is today?
Well, so what was interesting is the other day I was looking at the news, and something popped up in the news about Citigroup, and it was an article that said that Citigroup is stripping its chief operating officer of responsibility after a $136 million fine. And that reminded me that you and I, about 2 or 3 months ago, we had a big conversation about this. This was our conversation about the Office of the Currency Controller and the fines that they were imposing because of the way that certain banks were not complying with their mandated rule to renovate their data management and data governance activities. And so Citigroup, the number stuck out of my mind. Citigroup stuck out of my mind. I read through the article, and this is great because, and I think you're going to love this, that what the company does, and this is actually kind of funny in a different way. I'm going to read a little bit from the article. Citigroup is stripping Chief Operating Officer Anand Selva of his responsibility for a key piece of its compliance work after the bank was fined $136 million by regulators this summer for reporting failures. According to people familiar with the changes, he will no longer head the data overhaul team working to satisfy regulators that the bank's compliance systems are up to scratch. He will lose responsibility for about 800 employees. His responsibility for data compliance will now be shared with Tim Ryan, the former accountant and top PwC partner who joined Citi in June. It makes Ryan, who's the CTO, the third senior Citi executive in 3 years, to oversee the task of fixing the bank's persistent data problems. So what was interesting, you and I were chatting about this just before. When I work at a place and somebody is given a task and they don't do it, there are consequences. So, you kind of raised that issue, and I'll defer to you if you've got some comment or question about the consequences.
My take on the consequences are that there haven't been any. I mean, so they removed responsibility for 800 employees. He didn't lose his job. He's been there for 33 years. He's been promoted up the ladder. This guy is as steeped and embedded into this corporate culture as any human being can be. And he was apparently where the buck stopped for this particular compliance failure, and all that happened is they made his job easier.
Right. So let me I got to read one more sentence, and then I got to give you my feedback on that. The shift is seen as an acknowledgement that he had been stretched too thin, according to a person close to the bank, and that adding another executive to the effort would speed up the overhaul. So
yeah, well, when you've been there for 33 years, I mean, it's not like you're not aware of your job.
Well, so
I'm sure a 33-year veteran who's worked himself all the way up to the top of the tower in New York has a few other people helping him to his job.
Right. So my reaction to this is you're absolutely right, which is like this is a guy who is like, you know, one of the top 5 people in the company. He clearly has been around for a long time. He wields a lot of collateral, I would say, because, you know, where I've worked, in places where I've worked, if you are given a job and you not only don't do the job but actually end up getting your company fined a big chunk of money for it, they don't gently move you over to another role and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you're overworked." They give you a pink slip and they tell you to clean out your office. So you know, like, I don't really, you know, like, there's also a different lingo that corporate officers use when they talk about their employment status, you know, and I think there's a level of detachment that is not really going to be, you know, released to Financial Times about what this guy's status is. But, you know, again, when you don't do your job in a regular workplace, they'll give you another opportunity to go do less work and take away your responsibility and give it to somebody else, you know, and let you kind of hang around. So anyway, that what actually happens remains to be seen. But the point that I want to make is that go back to that other sentence that I read, which was the difficulty that they have in fixing. Oh, here the third executive in 3 years to oversee the task of fixing the bank's persistent data problems. And I think that's what I want to focus on today, and really drill down into why do we even have this compliance issue. And you referred to Basel, you referred to BCBS. I'm going to refer specifically to one set of principles called BCBS 239, and those of you who are either in the banking industry or are in the data management industry will probably know what that means if you do work with clients or customers who are in the financial or banking industries. But it actually goes back to, you know, I'm not even going to say this is ancient history, but if you recall back in the late 2000s, you know, starting in 2007 and moving towards 2008, 2009, we had what is referred to as the subprime meltdown. And a little bit about that subprime meltdown, you know, what was the cause of that? What was it? It was a sharp increase in high-risk mortgages that went into default beginning in 2007. And so there were, you know, again, this is kind of interesting too, and I don't want to dwell on this because I don't really know the details, but there were certain laws that were intended to increase the ability of people who traditionally had not been given an opportunity to own homes to be able to get access to loans to be able to buy a home. And so this whole industry kind of cropped up, or sub-industry, which was these subprime, I mean, they didn't call them subprime mortgages. They were these very interesting mortgage products where you could get like an adjustable rate mortgage where you'd pay a really low rate for the first 7 years, but then after 7 years, the rate on the mortgage would ratchet up based on the existing interest rates that were out there in the banking world. And so a lot of people got these loans, and a lot of people who got these loans did not really understand the extent to which they were going to be exposed. And what I'm really saying is there's other fault and failures there, such as some of the banking loan officers, and, you know, we talked about loan officers some other time in another one of our episodes, and their inability to comply with the law. Some of them were more invested in trying to increase their own commissions than to make sure that the banks on which they were representing the money that they're were lending to people who could afford to pay back the loan. And so it's fine when you know, in the magical world where you can buy a home today and a week from now you can sell it, you can flip it for and make $100,000, because if I've got an adjustable rate loan, well, that loan gets paid off when I make the sale, and now whatever money I've invested in the down payment, and in some cases, not only was there no down payment, they actually grouped the closing costs into the loan. So you could buy a house with no money, with a really low introductory rate, The problem there, though, is that people didn't understand that when the interest rates go up, that causes other people not to want to buy mortgages because the interest rates are higher. Buy houses because the mortgage rates are higher. And then, of course, what ends up happening is, the rates go up. There's fewer people fueling the economy, which means that a lot of jobs are being lost. So imagine you're this one guy who dreamt of buying a house and got one of these loans, and 5 years later no longer has a job, and his $1,000 a month mortgage is about to ratchet up to $3,500 a month. Well, what do you do in this case? And many people in this case, what they did was they dropped the keys on the counter, cleared out all their stuff, and just left, and then allowed the loans to default. So you end up with all these failed loans, and the banks that are holding those mortgages, what they had done is they had taken those mortgages. I'm really drilling down into this, so let
me give just a perspective on that, because there was that massive financial crisis in 2008, and there was significant implications to that, which we can talk about. But very large, well-established financial institutions went away.
Yeah, so I'm about to get to that.
Well, before you do, let me just because the reaction to that was twofold. On the banking side, I think the banking industry has their set of regulations now, that the Basel regulations. That was the BCBS compliance standards is basically the banking industry and the financial institution industry regulations. What also came out of that is Dodd-Frank, which is the United States government's reaction to protecting what you were just describing, which is the consumer, the taxpayer, for this crazy risky behavior that was taking place within the mortgage industry and subsequently in the financial industry, when they began to bundle these mortgages into securities, and the whole house of cards effectively came apart, all at the same time, when the economy turned just slightly. I believe there's a great movie around that that has some amazing scenes.
The Big Short. It's a book by Michael.
The Big Short.
Michael, what's his name? Lewis, who has long been writing about the interesting culture of Wall Street. But he wrote this book, and they turned it into a movie with the guy from The Office. What's his name?
Yeah. Steve
Carell.
Carell.
He's in that. Steve Carell. Yeah, he's in that. It's a pretty good movie. But
so those are the two. So those are the two implications, or the two results that came out. So we can go down the Dodd-Frank one if you'd like, but I think what we want to do is go down the BCBS one with regard to where compliance is these days.
Right. No. So to get to that story, I need to finish this little thing, which is you're exactly right. It's not the banks that were making the loans that became the issue. It was these financial institutions that were buying up all these loans and collateralizing them into mortgage obligation security types. And so what that is this big pool of loans that, if I bought 1,000 loans, there's 1,000 people who are paying a monthly mortgage fee, and then I can draw a cash flow from each one of those mortgages. So if I take all these mortgages and bundle them together, then I've got this whole bundle of cash flow. So even if people sell their houses, then, and that takes the cash flow out of that security, then I can just replace it with another one. And so a lot of these, financial institutions, and ones that have been around for 150 years, specifically Lehman Brothers is one. Another one that was doing this was Bear Stearns. I have a particular interest in that because I worked at Bear Stearns when I was in college. So I know a little bit about the history there. But what happened was these guys had all these pools of loans that all of a sudden people were defaulting on. And so instead of having this expectation of cash flow, now they've got all these distressed assets that are basically worthless. And so all this money that they invested, or that they're representing in these collateralized loan obligation securities, is basically junk, and which means that whatever assets they thought they had, they actually have none of them. So what happened with Bear Stearns was they said, okay, well, yeah, there's a problem, and they went to the federal government, and the government said, okay, fine, we're going to help you get bought out. And that's exactly what they did, is that they arranged to be bought out by some other organism, which I believe was JP Morgan, bought them out. Well, Lehman Brothers was in an even worse boat, and the government basically, they went to the government and they said, hey, you bailed out Bear Stearns, what about us? And somebody there basically said, hey, here's a problem. We do you, and then the next one, and then the next one. We're not going to be able to keep doing this. And you guys, the unstated thing here is you guys have been skirting the rules and trying to turn stuff into, turn dust into gold and sell it until people realize it's actually dust. We're not going to keep bailing you out. And that's exactly what they did. They said, we're not bailing you out. Go figure it out on your own, which they were unable to do. And a large part of this is the underlying part for this BCBS 239, which is counterparty risk. There was no way for them to be able to conjure up what the actual exposure was to this downside of the mortgage, the meltdown. And so if I'm going to go buy something, I'm not going to go buy something where I say to them, oh, I'm going to go buy your car. And they'll say, okay, yeah, the car is really great. And I'll buy the car and then get into the driver's seat, drive it away, and try to turn the ignition, and it turns out there's no engine inside the car. So, but that's one thing, because if I'm buying a car, I can go open up the hood and look at it. But here, it's as if they were going to go open up the hood, and then there's a big sheet over the, underneath the hood that says, do not touch. There's no way to find this out. And that's because of data. And that's because they were unable to be able to get aggregate values of the risk exposure associated with all this. And that's what happened. They failed. That triggered this global recession, the worst recession since the global depression, and that went on for a bunch of years until they managed to generate all these laws that dump money into the economy, and that's what they did. But they also said, however, Dodd-Frank is a good example. You got to be more accountable, and that's where these things all kind of stem from, which is a level of accountability. And there's this whole concept of this thing called BCBS 239, and just a little bit about this, a little more. It's like many of the large firms had a siloed approach to corporate governance. And in many cases, I'm reading from an article. We're going to make sure we get you the links. In many cases, these firms were an amalgamation of different cultures and businesses, resulting from a series of mergers and acquisitions that left a tangle of cultural conflicts and conflicting systems. The fragmentation poses a significant challenge to bank holding company boards, which need to have relevant information on existing and emerging risks in business units across the firm before acting on it. In a 2007 survey of banks, so this is when this is happening, only 10% of firms had adopted a holistic approach to risk management. Post-crisis guidance seeks to correct this deficiency by emphasizing an enterprise-wide integrated approach to risk and, in some areas, compliance. And that's what Basel 239 is supposed to be, or BCBS 239. It seeks to remedy this poor risk data aggregation and information flow. So bottom line, what this is saying is these companies, if you actually look at Citigroup is called Citigroup not because it's a bank, it's because it is a holding company for a bunch of other companies. And I have no idea how many companies, but I will tell you that there was another firm that I had done work with where they probably had hundreds of companies that were actually operating as part of the holding company. And so they go out, they buy these companies, they never adequately merge the information associated with everything that's being done. And so they have this fragmented visibility into what their actual risk is. And that's the setting. That's why we have this thing. Maybe
Well,
we
it's
can.
interesting because the the naming convention of the latest kind of macro Basel III, the next generation of risk-weighted assets from BCBS is known as Basel III Endgame. like they took it out of a Marvel movie.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like it's almost named as if to say we're not doing this anymore.
Yeah. Well, look,
We're not going to have Basel IV.
you know what we said about compliance in our first episode. It's one of those things that you're compelled to do, but you don't really want to because it doesn't really get you any value. The value is avoiding fines, and people don't count that until you actually get fined. So why don't we after the break, why don't we go into what the principles are of this BCBS 239?
All right, sounds good. We'll be right back.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.
All right, David, let's get into this regulation, in specific the BCBS 239.
239, yes. So there's a document that they released. I mean, it's actually kind of funny. I think it was released in 2013. And they have this little quote here at the beginning. This is from T.S. Eliot. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we have lost in information? I mean, it's funny to have a quote from a poet in the middle of some kind of banking regulation, but, different strokes for different folks. Anyway, paragraph 1 basically lays it out. It says, one of the most significant lessons learned from the global financial crisis that began in 2007 was that banks' information technology and data architectures were inadequate to support the broad management of financial risks. Many banks lack the ability to aggregate risk exposures and identify concentrations quickly and accurately at the bank group level, across business lines, and between legal entities. Some banks were unable to manage the risk properly because of weak risk data aggregation capabilities and risk reporting practices. This had severe consequences to the banks themselves and to the stability of the financial system as a whole. So they're laying it out, even though they're still I think they're still underselling it. I mean, it had severe consequences, and it basically pushed the world into a global recession. But
read that sentence again. It's like severe consequences to the banking industry, not to the world at large.
To the financial system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's like, again, there's a lot of us who believe that despite Lehman Brothers eating it in the end, almost everybody skated.
Oh yeah, they all walked away with their multi-million-dollar bonuses.
I don't remember anybody going to jail. I don't think anybody went to jail.
Look, don't get me started. Okay, but anyway, this whole thing is about. I mean, but they do bottom line it right there, which is, from IT and data architectures are inadequate to support management of financial risks. That's like literally what we talk about, almost every time we talk. So what I want to do is walk through this document. Has, and again, we'll provide a link to this, but it's definitely worth reading. A set of principles that are supposed to apply to key internal risk management models, including capital models and advanced measurement approaches for operational risk and other key management models like value-add risk. These are terms that are used in the banking industry, but I'm not gonna read verbatim every single thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump through the principles, and I think there's like 13 or 14 principles. So put your seatbelt on.
Well, and just to provide just a little bit more kind of perspective on this document, this was crafted by a group of international financial leaders, bankers across effectively the entire Western world, if you will. from Australia, well, China, Germany,
No,
Hong
across the
Kong,
world.
Italy, Japan, Netherlands, UK, United States. I mean, it was basically everybody was at the table when they crafted this thing. So this was not a small achievement, and I'm sure was wordsmithed deeply.
So let me just jump into it. Principle number 1, the introduction to this section: a bank should have in place a strong governance framework, risk data architecture, and IT architecture. These are preconditions to ensure compliance with the other principles. In particular, a bank's board should oversee senior management's ownership of implementing all the risk data aggregation and risk reporting principles and the strategy to meet them with a time frame agreed with their supervisors. So this goes back to our friend, the former the CEO that was just relieved of his duties. Clearly,
Not all of them.
but and we're gonna get to this whole thing went into effect in 2016. So we'll cycle back on that also. So number 1, governance. A bank's risk data aggregation capabilities and risk reporting practices should be subject to strong governance arrangements consistent with other principles and guidance established by the Basel Committee. So, the initial description here, or the next paragraph, says the bank's board and senior management should promote the identification, assessment, and management of data quality risks as part of its overall risk management framework. So to me, who built a career on data quality, I love seeing stuff like this, because they're basically saying, oh, what you care about is something that is so critical that we're going to make it the first thing the first principle that you need to do. And so this should include service level standards for outsourced and in-house risk data related processes, and a firm's policies on data confidentiality, integrity, and availability, as well as risk management policies. So to me, this is great, right? It says data quality is important. It says data protection or data confidentiality is important. Data integrity is important, and data availability is important. And you need governance to make sure that all this works. So that's number 1. So principle number 1, bottom line, it's a data problem. So I'm going to jump to number 2, data architecture and IT infrastructure. A bank should design, build, and maintain data architecture and IT infrastructure that fully supports its risk data aggregation capabilities and risk reporting practices, not only in normal times, but also during times of stress or crisis, while still meeting the other principles. And so the second paragraph in this section says, a bank should establish integrated data taxonomies and architecture across the banking group, which includes information on the characteristics of the data or metadata, as well as use of single identifiers or unified naming conventions for data, including legal entities, counterparties, customers, and accounts. Now, yet again, this is bottom lining what you and I talked about also a different few weeks ago, where we were talking about taxonomies and semantic layer. This is what it's saying, that your organization needs to have a metadata strategy that allows us to know how to get access to the data in a uniform way so that we can do risk data aggregation properly.
Yeah, I mean, just to provide some perspective on this particular principle, this is not a small undertaking. The idea that, a large financial institution can just re-architect their entire IT infrastructure to incorporate these principles is just not that simple. Granted, this was 10 years ago, and so we would hope that they have at this point in the course of their improving their IT infrastructure in general and upgrading their data architecture. But the guidance here is a bank should do all these things. It isn't a bank must do all these things.
Right. And if you want to understand the complexity of doing this, there's a guy that I'm going to refer you to. His name is Anand Selva, who's the guy who was stripped of his responsibility because clearly it was too difficult for him and his 800 people to execute.
Well, and again, the devil's in the details, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you decide you're going to, take the lead on implementing this principle, you run into an IT quagmire.
Well, it's a culture thing too.
Yeah, right. It's a darn too,
Right,
particularly
right.
at large organizations. It's
Yeah,
a bureaucracy. It's a tangle. The dirty secret in most large organizations is their data's a mess.
Yeah, I mean, like my primary recommendation to them would have been to have called me, and and maybe I could have helped them because
Get in there,
I'm
roll
not
up the
bound.
sleeves.
Yeah, I'm not bound by their golden shackles of needing to come up with some fake metrics to demonstrate that I actually did something all year, so I can get my bonus. It's like, pay me my exorbitant fee for being a consultant. I'll come in and tell you the truth, and then I'll give you some recommendations about where you need to fish or cut bait. We're only at number two.
I always want to just, because I have to throttle myself sometimes when I'm all outraged and have to recognize, okay, it isn't exactly easy. I appreciate the complexity involved in maintaining. Well, principle number 3, accuracy and integrity.
Yeah, it's just about, you took the words right out of my mouth. Accuracy and integrity. A bank should be able to generate accurate and reliable risk data to meet normal and stress crisis reporting accuracy requirements. Data should be aggregated on a largely automated basis so as to minimize the probability of errors. Well, just those two things are like, that is sitting on top of a mountain of complexity, because how do you even define what accurate and reliable means if you have no visibility into what was supposed to be addressed by principle number 2, which is a semantically accurate representation of all the risk exposure that exists across the dozens or scores or hundreds of companies that are owned by your holding company.
Well, and is it your experience, David? I mean, when you have something like we talked about, where the entire financial world has kind of weighed in on these principles, do you have kind of best practices sharing happening at this level, or is this, I'm not going to tell you how I'm doing it, even though, and you'll get this kind of bell curve of implementation against this sort of thing, where some will get it pristine and others will fail, and most everybody else will remain somewhere in the middle?
I don't know if I can answer that other than saying
they wouldn't typically share.
Right, I mean, like,
how
these
they're
are competitors.
doing it.
They're competitors,
right? They're competitors ultimately, right?
So
it's
so
like, you're all here. Here's our principles. Good luck.
Yeah,
and you're gonna get this level of, where you are gonna have people like Citigroup maybe at the left-hand side of the bell curve.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I would have to go do a little more research to see who else is getting fined, but you're hitting the nail on the head there, which is yeah, you can have these guys sit around and pontificate about what they think is a good principle, but they're holding in their back pocket. They're advocating on behalf of the practices that they already do in their organization and trying to push against the ones that are going to make them have to do something. So who knows whether any of these organizations are sharing best practices. I mean, there are organizations that are seeking to help to do some data management practices for the industry. But again, it's up to each organization to adopt those practices and do it in a way that, that meets their needs. And again, I'm not gonna argue with you. I'm just gonna say,
I don't want to get us off the rails too completely. So, let's go to principle 4.
I'll stay on principle 3 for a minute because there were two things there. One was even understanding what accuracy is defined as, and the second is automating the data aggregation. I mean, like that means if I want to create one number, which is the value at risk, I gotta touch all these different touch points and to automate that means I've got to have a bunch of rules and a bunch of transformations and a bunch of pipelines and all sorts of different things that need to be in place to be able to number one, automate it. But second of all, even if I automate it, I need to put a bunch of controls into that automation process to ensure that I'm not doing something wrong in the process of automating it. So, it's funny. It's like when it says where a bank relies on manual processes and desktop applications like spreadsheets and databases, and has specific risk units that use these applications for software development should have effective mitigants in place e.g., end-user computing policies and procedures and other effective controls that are consistently applied across the bank's processes. So that's not even talking about the automation, what we say today, like robotic process automation, all that. This is saying, yeah, we get it. There's like all you guys are running your business on Excel, and if we want to do this, you can't do that anymore. And like try to say to some guy who's been running his business on Excel that he can't run on Excel, you better give him a way that's way easier, i.e. do
Again,
it on AWS and put an Excel interface on top of it.
In 2013, it was probably shocking how immature the systems were.
I mean, here's another one. A bank should strive towards a single authoritative source for risk data per each type of risk. So you and I, we talked about this also when we talked about unique identification. It's like, okay, well, I want to have an authoritative source. So how do I determine what's the authoritative source? Again, so it's great because there's so many good practices in here from a data management perspective. But now I'm going to do what you said before. I'm going to jump to number 4, completeness. A bank should be able to capture and aggregate all material risk data across the banking group. Data should be available by business line, legal entity, asset type, industry, region, and other groupings as relevant for the risk in question, that permit identifying and reporting risk exposures, concentrations, and emerging risks. Well, really what that's saying is you need to be able to be able to categorize and classify all the data, be able to do that consistently across all of your data sources, and be able to allow for slicing and dicing according to any of these categories. I agree with that heavy sigh there.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this, and it's like supervisors expect banks to produce aggregated risk data that is complete and to measure and monitor the completeness of their risk data. Where risk data is not entirely complete, the impact should not be critical to the bank's ability to manage its risks effectively. It's like, okay.
So we've got one data quality dimension in Principle 4. Principle 5 has got another data quality dimension of timeliness. It should be able to generate aggregate and up-to-date risk data in a timely manner, of course, while also meeting the principles relating to accuracy and integrity, completeness, and adaptability. So it's saying not only do you have to have completeness, but it has to be up to date. And so there's enough, again, you think about you're the guy who's being tasked with implementing this. You've got to be able to then determine what's the timing cadences for timeliness. Is it I've got to be able to generate a report by 9 a.m. every single workday? It then says precise timing will depend upon the nature and potential volatility of the risk being measured, as well as its criticality to the overall risk profile of the bank. Well, once I read that sentence, now all of a sudden I'm thinking, no, it's not 9 o'clock the next day. It's on a continuous basis because at any point, if some black swan event takes place, like Russia devalues its currency or there's a nuclear accident in Kosovo or something that is now going to cause some kind of chain reaction in the financial markets, I got to know, like how much do I have invested in nuclear power plants in the European Union, or what's my current exposure to devalued rubles? So it's not saying there's a precise timing that is, it's 9 o'clock every day or 5 p.m. It's immediate and continuous.
Well, and again, I think the macro dynamic here was at least that led to the financial crisis, and I think it's still a macro dynamic to this, is that financial investment institutions are supercharging their systems to maximize return for their investors, whereas banks are just moving at a different pace. And I would argue they're moving at a much, much more lackadaisical pace, or have been, because they're not playing the same game. And as a result, their systems aren't keeping pace with the systems of the investment community. And actually, I think part of the Dodd-Frank fallout was to split banks out of the investment game, right? Wasn't that a principle of the whole thing?
I'd have to go back and reread that. Maybe we'll save that for a future.
But again, I the way I read this, it's, banks need to build their risk systems to be capable of producing aggregated risk data rapidly during times of stress and crisis for all critical risks. It's like, okay, yeah, but you're already behind the curve on that.
Right.
I mean, if that's a principle that you're still trying to internalize, the rest of the investment community has blown by you because speed generates return.
Right, and it's not just that; it's that there's all these nimble new you could compare some startup fintech company that is zeroing in on one particular area of the financial industry, and it could be much more agile at adapting to the environment because they're building their environment from scratch, and they're not sitting on top of a 50-year-old infrastructure that is also embeds the culture of Wall Street investment firms that pervades the way everybody in the organization works. And so these banks, they've got to be able to adapt to both the evolution of how information is being used for monetization in that industry, as well as watching their backs to make sure they're not missing some competitive risk that is rapidly gaining on them. So I can keep reading through these principles. I think what I'd rather do is kind of just summarize them more in general, which is saying these principles are basically saying to banks, if you don't get your data management and data governance in line with what the expectation is going to be, you're going to be at risk of failing. So it's not really the compliance problem. It's really the financial risk problem of information risk, which is if you can't figure this out, somebody's going to beat you to some new business. Or if you can't figure this out when there's some event that takes place, you're going to fail, right? So that's where, when you asked me before, which risk are we looking at? It starts out with compliance, but it ends up with I would say orders of magnitude greater financial risk.
Yeah. This is, what you would expect from an organization that is trying to maintain its position of authority and confidence in the larger economy and in the eyes of the world. That they needed to put this together and outline this as a way to reassure people that they indeed take this seriously. Now the question then gets down to, so how are they doing?
So why don't we cycle back on that after the break?
All right, sounds good.
Want more Insight Jam? Follow us on Instagram for exclusive content like a daily dose of best practices and buying advice from industry experts and leading solution providers. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel for long-form highlights from our expert panel discussions. The Solutions Review team is hard at work collecting the best enterprise technology information from around the globe, so don't miss out.
All right, David. So, how's everybody doing, right? The best laid plans of the banking industry. As we said, the larger doc for Basel III is this idea of an endgame, which again I think is oddly named, or maybe not so oddly named. Maybe that's it. It's the last one they plan to do. But it's fascinating because what you end up with is this great set of principles, and we're all going to adhere to this as best we can, but until we can't. And it feels to me a lot like that's where we are, that the establishment is starting to push back. It doesn't take a very deep Google search to find criticisms of Basel III Endgame. I thought it was fascinating. Actually, one of the sources is Brookings Institute, which I would consider to be a mouthpiece for the establishment, the amorphous establishment that we all know is out there. And And what are the major arguments against this Basel III endgame? Well, critics say it's overkill, will discourage lending, will push lending and other activities outside the regulated banking system to less regulated institutions. Right? We're over-regulating ourselves. It's a cry for help to whom the new capital requirements won't apply. And so, the banking institution, which created this set of principles, is starting to find ways to get other voices like the Brookings Institute, which I would argue is probably funded in large part
by the banking industry,
by the banks, that they're coming out with a policy paper that says, well, if you keep going down this path, who knows who people are going to get loans from? It won't be from our, well-established, credible, regulated institutions.
It has severely limited our accessibility to widows and orphans to be able to steal their money. So,
well, again, it's like there's a big path between the press release and the practical implementation. And oftentimes the press release is nothing more than just that. Nothing to see here. Here, see, we've told you we're going to do all the right things. Go back to TikTok or pay attention to something else. Don't worry about us.
Well, I mean, you asked me at the beginning. You said, "Well, how are we doing?" And October, November of last year, 2023, they actually did, there was actually an industry-wide survey or assessment of the degree to which the banks were observing or implementing those principles. And I'm going to read, from this report, which also, as always, we're going to put into the comments. Between 2013 and 2020, the committee published 6 reports on banks' progress towards full implementation. And then they say, despite banks' continuous efforts to implement the principles, some banks are still struggling with the adoption. According to the last progress report, this was the one prior to this one, published in April 2020, none of the assessed banks were fully compliant with the principles. Also, the Financial Stability Board's March 2021 Too Big to Fail evaluation report identified gaps in the field of risk data aggregation and noted that banks need to improve the risk data aggregation and reporting framework. So that term, risk data aggregation, which was pervasive across the principles, they're basically saying, okay, well, 6 years after this was put into play, they're still not doing it. But really, that if you read through the report, there's a great little graphic in here that kind of maps out compliance by principle between 2017, 2019, 2022, and they list 10 of the principles, right? Governance, data architecture, and IT infrastructure, et cetera. A lot of the ones that we looked at. Out of the 11 that they look at, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them are doing worse in 2022 in terms of compliance than they were in 2019. And so it shows, and then they say that the compliance assessment shows that nearly 10 years after the initial publication and 7 years after the data compliance, banks are, quote unquote, at different stages in terms of aligning with the principles, and that additional work is required at all banks to attain and or sustain full compliance. So you're right, and so the articles and the papers that you were referring to when you look at the criticism of Basel III is basically these guys saying, yeah, we know we're not able to do this. So instead of trying to figure out how to really make it work, we're going to push back and say, well, it's too much for us to do. It's obstructing our ability to do work. We don't like having the government sitting around and overseeing us. Instead, we foxes want to exercise our own oversight over the hen house, and that we will set up our own rules about the amount of capital the bank is going to hold, or what kind of assets we need to have in place, and whether we are going to be in a position to be able to succeed or not.
Yeah, and again, I recognize how complicated this is, and when you make these broad, bold, public reassurances that, we've got this set of principles and we're going to get everybody to get on board and do it. Again, the devil is in the details. It's complicated. It's hard. You're talking about organizations that are global and massive and have built very large functioning systems that you just can't rip and replace overnight. And so, 6 years, I would argue 6 years is probably a short time frame for getting some of this stuff done. But the fact of the matter is that if you ask me, people like COOs of these organizations who have been, by my count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, been in 13 positions within Citigroup over 33 years, is not qualified to be leading any of that. They're just moving up the ladder. I look at the positions this person's been in. They haven't been in a position for more than 3 years twice. They're just hopscotching their way to the top of the corporate ladder. This is not somebody steeped in technical ability. They're a corporate creature that is capable of, moving up the food chain. And so, in fairness, it's unrealistic to expect that person to have a firm grasp on the technical implementations of such far-ranging IT systems at Citigroup.
If you drill down into this graphic and look at how they map it out, it talks about the percentages of the reporting banks that are largely compliant, fully compliant, materially non-compliant. It's still kind of shocking to see that after all this time and after the firepower that you are implying that the banks are throwing at this problem, that you still have 23% of the banks in 2022 are materially non-compliant with the second principle about data architecture and IT infrastructure. Yet, it's clear that this is an industry that runs on data. And, what the Basel III and what they want to be able to do is what they're trying to do is establish a means for ensuring that there's a cushion of comfort for these organizations when there's actually some kind of crisis. And the banks are not operating in a mode of we have to deal with a crisis. They're operating in the mode of we have to generate value for our shareholders, or we have to generate our, large bonuses or whatever it is that's motivating them. But they, the protection of assets apparently is something that concerns them. So if you look at this article that you referenced, it's saying that the regulators are proposing, and they make a point of saying that it's 316 pages of small type in the Federal Register. But what they're saying is that the net effect is to increase the required highest grade capital to increase by about 16% on average. And then they say, put differently, the largest banks would have to hold an additional 2 percentage points of capital, or an additional $2 of capital for every $100 of risk-weighted assets. So that's just saying, we just want you to have a cushion in case there's some kind of problem, and we want that cushion to be bigger than you want it to be. And their problem is, well, that $2 is I could have done something with those $2, and you just want me to put it away and put it into the vault and hold on to it. And we're thinking we could take those $2 and by tomorrow we could turn it into $2.03, and then we'll compound that, whatever. But they're not saying, okay, yeah, we get it that there's a possible financial risk. But what they're also not saying in this article is they're not addressing the fundamental thing that the principles in BCBS 239 were intended to address, which is failures in the ability to manage their data. So, you can keep trying to bypass it, but you're going to get bit by it eventually.
Well, and it's not getting any less complicated. The world is moving faster and faster. The banking industry is going to have to deal with this. And truth of the matter is, with the advent of AI and blockchain and cryptocurrency, Lord knows the threats. But I always say that, the titans of industry that we know today are not going to be the titans of industry tomorrow. That the titans of the AI revolution are still in high school. They haven't invented the things that are coming, but they will, and they will be compelling, just like Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and Bezos and Amazon and Jobs and Gates. There are young people who are going to come and improve on what exists, make things incredibly compelling based upon the new technologies available to them that they only have grown up knowing. And these banks, if you ask me, are going to be under, like Brookings says, there's this overregulation or that they claim may cause people to begin to look for loans through alternate sources. There may be a new banking type that emerges from the AI revolution. I would hope it does, just to drive home the point.
You're potentially opening up a can of worms, because who knows, if I'm going to an alternate place for getting money that's less regulated, then there's even bigger risks to that as well. So I will agree with you 90% and reserve some part of that to say, hey, there's a bunch of data issues that are information risks there as well, and we can't ignore them. So maybe we should encourage our high schoolers to build data governance into their infrastructures when they launch their garage-based financial institution, as opposed to ignoring them the way the too big to fail banks have been doing.
Or you build it, you bake it in when you build the new thing, right? So I think part of the challenge for these major banks is that they're playing catch up against regulations that are now being imposed upon them that they just never grew up having, and because of the abuses. But now a new competitor would come along. I would expect, that you couldn't become a significant source of lending without having to be compliant to the regulations of banking. But you would know that when you built it, and you would bake all that in, and that may be your competitive advantage.
Well, you would expect that to happen, but as you can tell by certain news reports recently about people launching their own cryptocurrency, there are people who latch onto that because of its absence of governance and oversight, even if they completely don't understand how it's supposed to work. So wide open field, lots of opportunities, lots of I would recommend to any nascent industry like that to don't ignore the data. That's my bottom line.
Well, and I think that's a good place to end. But I think that's the whole point, is that you can't ignore the data anymore, or you are going to be at risk. And that we would hope that rather than pushing back and trying to play catch up or making excuses for all the reasons why you can't be compliant, that you lean into it and overpower the requirements and find a way to get all this data de-risked.
Yeah, so maybe we'll talk about that in an upcoming episode, about what does it mean to de-risk your data. Sounds like an interesting topic.
All right, David. Well, again, thank you very much for the time today. If anybody needs any help with their data de-risking, David Loshin is the man to call. You can find him on LinkedIn for sure, but you can also find him as a solutions review expert on the Insight Jam. And David, we will look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. And yeah, I think we'll have plenty more to talk about.
I hope so. This is great. Thanks.
You bet.